Hello there, all my lovely jewelry makers. I'm Christina of CSLdesigns, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this really cool intertwining wire Kumihimo bracelet. So it'll work great if you use multiple colours of wire so you really get that contrast, but of course you can also just use a single colour. And it's also ideal for oxidising as it has loads of texture. Now these pieces here will be available for sale in my shop where I sell more jewellery, kits and tutorials. And if you weren't aware, I actually have a book with Wire Kumihimo. I sell signed copies of that in my shop, so again, link will be in the description box down below. Otherwise, if you want to learn how to make these bracelets, then keep watching. So these are the materials that we'll need. Now the only gauge wire we're going to be using is a 0.6mm, but I do have it in two different colours, so I've got a copper one and a silver one. Of course you can use whatever colours you want to, and you can even still just use one colour if you prefer. This would also look great if you used bare copper wire and then oxidised the piece. Now to finish off the ends of our braid, I'm going to be using these ribbon ends here. They have these loops in them where we can attach our findings. So I've got a lobster claw clasp, an extender chain and a few jump rings to put it all together. And then along with our ribbon ends, I'm also going to be using this E6000 glue that's nice and strong. Now as for the tools, first of all, of course we need a square Kumihimo disc, and I'm just using a mini one. And then we need a couple of pliers for the wire. So of course we need some flush cutters so we can actually cut the wire. And then I've got tweezers and those pliers to help manipulate the wire. Now one more thing I'm just going to be using is this electrical tape. We're just going to put this around the groups of the wires when we start braiding, just so we can help hold them together. Now you'll be able to find the material list and useful links in the description box down below. Otherwise, let's get it all ready and let's get started. So before we can get started, we need to cut some lengths of our wire, and what I have is 16 lengths of each colour, and they're all about 40 centimeters each. Now what I've also done is I put them all in groups like this, so separated the colours out, and then I put some electrical tape around towards the end. But what I've just done is then bend the end of the wire back over the tape just to make sure they don't pull through as we start making our braid. Now we're just going to start working with one group of wires at a time. So I've just taken my silver one, it doesn't matter which one you start with. Then I'm going to bring in my disc, because first of all we need to attach our wires to the disc here. So I'm putting the end with the tape down through the hole in the center and just holding it towards the back wall. And I'm just grabbing onto it on the back here. And then what we need to do is distribute these lengths of wires on the top and the bottom side of the disc. And I'm just going to start from one side. Now what we want to end up with is all the wires across the middle of each side. So just start with where you need to place them to achieve that. So I'm placing one on the top, then I'm taking the next one, going to the bottom, the very opposite slot, and then moving one slot further over, placing the next wire, and then repeat on the bottom. And I'm just working my way all the way across to the other side until we've got all the lengths of wires distributed on the disc. Now for the two different groups of wires, we are going to use the same basic technique. We're just going to start it out slightly differently. So with this one here, I'm just going to start with making two separate braids alongside each other. And whenever we start a new round here, what we're going to do is always focus on the top two middle wires. And in this case, because I want to make separate braids, I'm going to keep them to the side that they're coming from. So if I release the left one out of those two middle ones, I'm going to then bring it out to the left side and place it into that slot on the side and just bring it straight out like that. And then I'm just going to swap hands, and I'm still just holding on to that little end underneath with the tape. Then I'm going to take the other one of those two middle ones, and this is the right one. That's going to come out to the right side and place it in the opposite slot there. Now we need to move all the top and bottom wires. So again, we're kind of always working as if we have a line going down through the center of the disc, and we have a left side and a right side. So I'm just going to start on the left, it doesn't matter what side you start on. But then again, just make sure you have that midpoint, and then I'm just going to use all the wires to the left here. So first of all, I'm taking the bottom one that's right opposite the empty slot on the top. Because we have that empty slot on the top, that means we need to bring this bottom one up and over the middle wire that we brought to the side, and then into that empty slot. And then we need to move one out towards the left here. Release that, bring it down over that wire going out to the side, and then into the empty slot on the bottom. Release the next one out, and then bring it up and over into the empty slot on the top. And we're literally working our way like this out towards the side of the disc, just one wire at a time, moving it to the opposite side. Next one out here, bring that to the top, and we're always then placing this next wire into the slot that was previously freed up from that movement we just did before. And we have one left on the bottom here. Bring that up and into the top slot. And then to complete this side, I'm going to take the side wire here and just bring it downwards and kind of push it tight against everything in the middle and then into that empty slot on the bottom. That way we now have all the wires on the left side here, on the top and the bottom in the original positions. They just kind of swap places among each other. But that was on the left side, so now I'm moving on to the right side. And that is the same principle. We have the empty slot on the top. That means I need to release the wire on the bottom. That's straight opposite it. And then bring that up and over the wire that goes out to the side there. And just place it into that empty slot. And then just move one wire out at a time towards the side. In this case towards the right of the disc because we're on the right side. And just as you go as well, smooth out your wire every time you're making movements. Up and over into the empty slot. And then down and over into the empty slot. And then the last wire here on the bottom, bring that up into the slot on the top. And then we just need to finish off this side by taking the wire on the side here, pushing it against all the wires in the middle, and then just bringing it down into the empty slot on the bottom. And then you can see we now have wires placed in all the original slots on the disc, and this was now one full round of the braid. So just to show you again, and remember we are making the individual braids alongside each other in this case. So that means out of the two middle ones on the top side there, the left one stays to the left, it just goes out to the side, and the right one stays to the right, and that just goes out to the side. And now they are straight opposite each other, and that's how we achieve kind of the gap in the middle between the two braids, is by bringing them out to the side where they're actually coming from. Now start moving the wires on the bottom to the empty slot, and on the top into the empty slot. And just move your way all the way out towards the side until you've used the last length. Just using one wire at a time, bringing the last one from the bottom up towards the top, and then this one on the side. We need to complete this side of the disc by bringing it down into the empty slot on the bottom. And now repeat on the other side. So I'm taking the bottom wire in the middle and then bringing that to the top empty slot. And again, just move one wire at a time out towards the side until we have the last one here. Bring that up. And then remember to bring in the one on the side back into the braid by bringing it down into the empty slot. And that was now another round of the braid. So what I'm going to do is just do a few more rounds like this, where we're separating the two braids from each other and they're kind of being made next to each other. So we have some lengths here at the beginning. So now I just made about 8 rounds or so. It doesn't have to be precise here at the end, as if we have too much we can always just cut off the excess when we're finishing off the ends of the bracelet. Rather have too much than too little. So now we've reached the point where we need to make our first connection point, and that means instead of doing the 2 separate braids next to each other, we need to actually make it one braid. So the difference here is the 2 middle wires on the top. Instead of keeping the left one to the left and keeping the right one to the right, we're actually now going to cross them. So what I'm going to do is release the right one of those 2 middle ones and bring that out towards the left. So the right one goes towards the left and still into that side slot, now just on the other side. And then the left one comes over towards the right and goes into the slot on that side. And that is how we achieve the braid becoming one, because they're now crossing in the middle. And otherwise we then just do the same thing. So we repeat all the bottom and top movements. So bring the wires from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top, working one wire at a time out towards the side until you have the one left, put it to the top, and then bring that side one back to the bottom here. So we now have this side back in place. Now we just need to repeat the same on the right side. So move the bottom to the top, top to bottom, working our way towards the side, moving that final wire here, and then bringing that side one back into the braid by bringing it down to the empty slot on the bottom. And we've now made another full round here, but this round is where we connected the 2 wires in the middle, and therefore we're now making one braid instead of 2 next to each other. So what I'm going to do is another round of this. So again, here we need to make it where it's connected. So I'm going to take the right one of the two middle ones there and bring it out towards the left. And the left one comes out towards the right. So we achieve that crossing point in the middle. And otherwise we move the bottom and top wires in the same way until the left side here is complete, and then just repeat the same on the right, and then complete this round by bringing the side one back into the braid on the bottom slot there. So this was another full round of where it's just one braid we're making. So we've done two like that now, and that's basically what I'm going to call the connection point. So I've done 2 rounds in the connection point. So from here I'm going to go back to making the 2 braids separately next to each other. So that means of the 2 middle ones there, if you remember, we're going to take the left one, keep it to the left side, and then take the right one and keep that to the right side. And instantly the braid is going to start splitting in the middle there, and we're going to end up then creating 2 braids next to each other, caused by continuing the movements otherwise. So all the bottom and the top wires basically move to the opposite side to where they're coming from. Finish off the left side, and then repeat on the right one, and then we'll finish off the first round of where we're making the braids next to each other. And just start another round in the same way, because now we need to make a section here where we have the individual braids next to each other before we then get to the next connection point. So now I've done 14 rounds here of the individual braids, and what you can do is count them as you go. So every time you make a round, that's obviously 1 and then 2 and then 3 rounds and so on. But personally I do that, but I tend to also lose track. So you can also look at your braid and then count the actual movements you've done in the braid, just to keep track along the way, and of course then count if you've made the right amount. So what you'll find is for every round you have a wire going across from one side to the other, so you could count that, or you could count the little loops on the sides. It's completely up to you how you want to count that, but you can count the individual rounds on the braid once you've made them. But from here we then need to make the next connection point. So let's bring in the 2 sides together and basically making 1 braid instead of the 2 separate ones next to each other. So if you remember, that means the 2 wires in the middle on the top side of the disc, instead of having them stay to the side where they belong, they need to now cross. So I'm just going to take the right one first. You could also start with taking the left one first. It doesn't matter as long as you make sure to stay consistent, but I'm just taking the right one, is what comes natural. But then also pull the braids tighter together there in the middle so they end up sitting right next to each other, and then bring the wire out to the side and into the slot. Take the left one of the 2 middle ones and then bring it out to the right side. And again, just making sure the 2 braids get pushed nice and close together so we don't have much of a gap in the middle there. Otherwise, we just want to pick back up the movements on the bottom and the top sides of the disc so they all basically swap places. Finish off the left side here, and then repeat the same on the right. Bring the side wire down to finish off this round, and then that's the first round of connecting them. Now we need to do another one like that. So we have the 2 rounds of connecting the 2 individual braids together, and then finish off that second round of the connection point. And we just have a look on the back. We can see we have our individual braids there that we were just making, and we've now connected them together. And we now need to go back to making the individual braids again. And that is where we separate the 2 wires in the middle on the top side, and they stick to the side where they belong. So the left one goes to the left and the right one goes to the right. And then otherwise you just keep going like this. Now what we want to do is, for these individual braided sections, we want to make the same amount of rounds as we did on the previous one there. So again, you can just count the rounds as you need to, and you just keep making the braid like this until we have a good length to work with. Now when it comes to the other group of wires, we're going to do the same basic technique of making the braid. The only difference is I'm just going to start it out opposite. So with the other ones, we started making the individual braids. Here I'm just going to start with the connection point. So that's literally the only difference. So again, the 2 middle ones, I'm going to make sure that they cross in the middle, which is how we achieve the connection point and making it 1 braid rather than 2 individual ones. And then we make our movements with all the remaining wires. Finish off one side at a time, then repeat on the other side and finish that off. And then we have our first full round. Now what I'm going to do is make more than 2 rounds with connection points here, just because it's the beginning. So again, rather have too much because we can always cut off the excess. So I'm just going to make a few rounds like this, where we have it being one braid rather than the 2 individual ones. So now I made about 6 rounds or so. Doesn't have to be anything precise, just so we have a length here to begin with. And from here, we basically just need to go right into the pattern that I showed you on the other group of wires. So we just need to switch to making the individual braids next to each other. So we bring the 2 middle wires here on the top. The left one goes to the left and the right one goes to the right. And then we make the same amount of rounds as we did with the other group. And after that, we make the 2 rounds of the connection point and then go back to making the individual braids. So we just now continue like I showed you before. And now that I carried on and made the whole length here, on the other end, what we just want to do is make another section of where we're just making 1 braid. So we make sure we cross the wires in the middle every time. And we're just basically doing that exactly how I did in the beginning, so we have something that we can finish off with if we need to. And then once we're finished braiding here, we can remove the braid from the disc. So just release all the lengths of wire, take the disc away. And then I just like to kind of straighten these out so they're not gonna poke onto things as we continue working with it. And then here we have the other braid that we then need to combine with the first one that we made. So that is what we're going to do now. And as you can see, I have both braids handy here. And what you want to make sure to do is make them substantially longer than the actual final bracelet we need to have, because first of all, they're going to get shortened as we start to intertwine them with each other. But also, I'd always rather have too much than too little, because you can always cut off the excess. But of course, you can add to it. So just for reference, the length of my braids here are roughly about 9 inches or so. And we also then need a pair of pliers I would personally recommend, because it's going to be a little bit tough on the fingers. So what I'm going to do is just start with one of the braids, and what we need to do is start opening up these gaps that we have in it. So I'm just going to start from one end and then we're going to work our way down. So I'm just going to be opening this up with the pliers and basically create the space that we need to be able to put the other braid through. So it's also by doing this motion, for instance, that is already now making the braid a bit shorter, because instead of these being straight up and down, they've now had a curve added into them. But we then need to take the other length, and just remember as well, we do have a front and a back to the braid, and I personally prefer to make sure they're both facing the same direction there. But then what I'm going to do is take the other braid, and we need to feed this through that gap and just bring it all the way down and sit roughly something like this. So the very first connection point in that braid there is going to sit in the middle of the gap that we just opened up. Now don't worry about it being perfect yet, we're going to obviously keep working with it. And then from here we need to move on, and I'm going to then open up the gap in the braid that we just added, in my case the silver one. So take your pliers again, open it up, just put it in between there and pull your pliers apart while we keep the braids nice and flat so they don't start twisting or anything. And once we have that one opened up, then you can probably guess that we need to then bring this copper one here, so the front one in this case, down through that gap now. So you just want to kind of bring up the braid and just put a gentle curve into it. Bring the end down through that gap we just opened up. Pull the braid all the way through to then end up sitting. So again, we have that first crossover point on the silver sitting in the middle of the first gap on the copper, and you can just keep pushing it flat as you go. Now from here we're going to repeat. This time we have the copper one on the back, so that is the one we need to open up next. So open up that next gap just using your pliers again, and again get it to about the same width as the other ones. Then bring up the silver one a bit so we can open up just enough space for the end to be able to come through that gap, and then gently pull it through. So the silver now ends up coming out on the back, and you can already start to really see the effect that we're going to get. So now the silver's on the back, so that's the next gap that we need to open. And basically you just want to keep going like this, just stepping down one gap at a time here, open it up, and then feed the front one through the gap from front to back. Pull that all the way through, nice and gentle, and then kind of flatten out on the back there. And you just want to keep going like this until we get to the other end and we've done all of the gaps and intertwined them in and out. And then what we need to start doing is finishing off the ends here. So of course we have all this excess wire that we need to get rid of. So I'm going to get my cutters, and I just want to basically finish off one end here so we have that nice and ready to go into our ribbon ends. So I'm just going to start on one side, and of course we just need to do a couple of wires at a time, working our way across to the other side. So we basically end up with a straight line going all the way across, going through that middle braid as well. Get rid of that, and then the last few lengths on the other side. So here we now have a nice and straight line on one end where the ribbon end is going to fit over just nicely. And of course we then need to measure the actual bracelets, so I'm just going to bring in my measuring tape, put that end towards the end of the measuring tape, measure how long I want it to be, remembering obviously we need to add a clasp, so that will add length to it. So I'm going to cut it right around here, and then we just want to do the same. Take your cutters, go through, start on one side and cut across to the other side. So again, we end up with a straight line on this end. And there we go. So we now have both ends ready to be finished off with our ribbon ends. So just to show you how that's going to look, we need to take our ribbon ends and basically place them on the ends here. And this is where having that straight line comes in really handy because they're going to fit in just nicely. But what we need to do for the extra security and make sure these are going to stay on is also use some glue. So that's where the E6000 comes in. So what I'm going to do is just get a bit on a toothpick and basically use that as my application tool. And then we want to place this first of all inside of the ribbon end. Now make sure you cover the inside walls here. We don't need to fill it up completely because it's going to come spilling out anyway. Remember, we need to put the actual braid in there as well. That's going to take up some space. I'm just going to cover the inside walls. And then I always like to use either what I have left on my toothpick or add some more and just put that on the end of the braid as well. Just make sure to get it in between the wires there in the nooks and crannies and on both sides, because that way when we put the two pieces together and the glue dries, it's going to really adhere nicely. So something a bit like that. And then of course we need to take the ribbon end that we already put glue inside, place it over the end of the braid, and then grab your chain nose pliers or flat nose, and we need to start clamping this down. So I like to put the bracelet in my hand and put a finger on either side as I'm then clamping it down, gradually going from side to side. That way I ensure that it's going to stay in the middle. And what I like to do is just before I get all the way down, I just remove my fingers to make sure it is still in the middle, because it can kind of move a little bit as we're clamping it down. But once you're happy with it, just make sure to go and do your final squeezes, and also just tighten down the ends. And then we've attached our ribbon end on this end here. And then of course we just need to flip it, repeat the same thing on the other end, leave the two ends to dry, and then we have these loops in the ribbon ends that we can attach our findings to. And once we then have the findings on there, all that's left to do is shape the bracelet. So I'm just going to go in from one end and start putting a curve into it. So just going from side to side, gradually adding a curve. Make sure that the side you like the best obviously is facing outward. And the aim is to get the two ends to be closer together, so we can of course use the clasp. Now you don't want to go into one place and just put a big bend into it, that'll put it more out of shape. But you can also shape it around something that has the size and shape you want it to have, like a bracelet mandrel or anything else you have handy. But as you can see, we're getting closer to having the ends in position so we can use the clasp. And once we have that, we can take our clasp, close it up, and then we have our bracelet finished and ready to wear. So I just wanted to show you an example of a different setup you can do, because you don't have to use the same amount of wires or the same gauge of wire. You can use more or less wires, where in this case I'm using 14 wires instead of the 16 before. And also the gauge here is a 0.5mm, and that's instead of the 0.6mm. So this is a thinner wire. That will of course also make it a bit easier to make the wire kumihimo. And then as you can tell as well, on this setup what I have is 8 lengths of wire across the top here, but on the bottom we only have 6, so it's an uneven amount. But that doesn't matter, we'll still use the same technique. The only difference is make sure that you start with the side that has the most wires on. So if you end up putting the most wires on the bottom, you just want to start from there. And again, you could also go down and use 10 wires in total. In that case you would end up with 6 on the top and 4 on the bottom, or the other way around depending how you set it up of course. But it's the same basic technique. Now the difference can also be in the rounds that you make on your braids. So when you make the individual braids, if you're using less wires here or a thinner gauge, you might also want to make a few less rounds in the individual braids. So that will determine the length of that, which also will then affect the open gap we get when we separate them out once we've made the braids and we're going to put them together. So for instance, in this case here, instead of making 12 rounds when we do the individual braids like we did on the previous one, I'm going to make 10 rounds on the individual braids alongside each other. But that's just to show you can make different variations of this. It doesn't have to just look one way. And we then have this really cool effect of the two separate braids intertwining with each other. And of course you will get the best effect if you use different colors for the two braids, but that's completely up to you and the look that you want. It would also work really well for oxidizing this design as there's so much texture to it. And like I showed you in the video, you can play around with how you want the final look to be. So you can use different amounts or gauges of wire and get different results. Now if you like Wire Kumihimo, I have loads more tutorials for it on my channel with different designs. I have a whole playlist full of them actually. I'm going to leave that in the description box down below. And I also actually have a book that's just pure Wire Kumihimo designs. Now you can buy that in all the usual places you buy your books, or I actually sell signed copies of them in my own shop. Again, you'll be able to see that down below. Otherwise, I really hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching it, and I'll see you in the next one.